It was supposed to be the proudest day of my life, my graduation day. But when I saw my mom arrive, covered in dirt and looking completely out of place, I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. Everyone was staring, and I could feel the weight of their judgment. But that wasn't the most shocking part. What happened next, when I took the microphone, left the entire crowd speechless. What I revealed in that moment changed everything. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what happened on that stage. Chapter 1: Introduction to the Graduation Day. The day had finally arrived, the day I had worked toward for years. My graduation. The culmination of sleepless nights, endless exams, and the constant pressure to succeed. I was surrounded by my classmates, all of us dressed in our identical caps and gowns, waiting to hear our names called. The atmosphere was buzzing with excitement and pride, a sea of smiling faces and proud parents in the crowd. For me, this day was supposed to symbolize victory, not just for myself, but for my family. We had come a long way, overcoming countless challenges to get to this moment. I thought about everything my mom had sacrificed to help me reach this milestone. She had always been my rock, the one person who supported me through thick and thin. I looked around the venue, scanning the audience to find my family. My heart skipped a beat when I finally spotted them in the back rows. My father, sitting with a proud smile, and my younger siblings, waving excitedly. But where was my mom? I felt a pang of nervousness. She'd never missed anything important in my life. I reassured myself that she'd be here any minute, probably just running late. After all, this day meant as much to her as it did to me. As I sat waiting for my name to be called, I allowed myself to imagine how perfect this moment would be. A proud walk across the stage, a brief handshake with the dean, and the cheers of my family behind me. But little did I know, everything was about to take an unexpected turn. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but I had no idea it would soon become one of the most unforgettable, for reasons I could never have anticipated. The perfect day was about to unravel in a way I never imagined. Chapter 2: The Unexpected Arrival. As the ceremony continued, the steady rhythm of names being called, applause filling the air, I kept glancing toward the back, searching for my mom. The longer I waited, the more anxious I became. And then, suddenly, I saw her. She was standing near the entrance, looking completely out of place. My heart dropped. She wasn't dressed for the occasion. Her clothes were dirty, her hair disheveled, and she looked as if she'd been through something unimaginable. She wasn't just late, she was in a state that immediately drew everyone's attention. The whispers started immediately. People turned to look, some nudging others to notice her. I could feel the judgment rippling through the crowd, and a flush of embarrassment swept over me. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I had envisioned my mom beaming with pride, looking polished and ready to celebrate with me. Instead, she stood there, visibly out of sorts, as if she had struggled just to make it here. I couldn't understand what had happened. How could she have let herself show up like this? On the most important day of my life. Anger and shame began to mix with confusion. The stares from classmates and their parents bore into me, and I couldn't focus on the ceremony anymore. All I could think about was my mom, and why she had arrived in such a shocking state. As my mind raced, I found myself sinking lower in my seat, wishing I could disappear. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a heavy lump forming in my throat. I wanted to run to her, to ask her what had happened, but I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the eyes of everyone around me. I looked at her again. Her eyes met mine from across the room. She gave me a faint, apologetic smile. But it wasn't enough to erase the embarrassment, the confusion, or the growing sense of dread I felt. And then, they called my name. Chapter 3: The Call to the Stage. My heart stopped when I heard my name. It echoed through the hall, cutting through the noise of applause and whispers like a sharp blade. For a moment, I sat frozen, the weight of everything pressing down on me. My body felt heavy, my legs suddenly weak. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I had dreamt about for years. But now, it felt like a nightmare unfolding in front of my eyes. I stood up slowly, the eyes of my classmates following my every move. Their smiles and excitement were gone, replaced by curiosity, confusion, and a touch of pity. I could feel the shift in the room, the way the attention had turned from celebration to the awkward spectacle my mother had unknowingly created. Each step I took toward the stage felt like I was wading through thick mud, the weight of embarrassment and confusion nearly unbearable. As I walked toward the stage, I glanced over at her again. My mother, still standing at the back, looked so out of place, her face a mixture of pride and something else I couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Shame? I couldn't tell, but it only made the knot in my stomach tighten further. Why was she here like this? What had happened to her? And why couldn't she have at least tried to blend in? My thoughts raced as I climbed the steps to the stage, my legs shaking beneath me. The lights overhead felt blinding, the room too hot. I felt exposed, as if everyone was waiting for me to make a mistake, to falter under the weight of this unexpected turn of events. The applause was polite, but it wasn't for me. It was just part of the ritual, something they did because they had to. But behind it, I could feel the tension, the questions they were all silently asking. Reaching the podium, I took a deep breath, my hands gripping the sides of it as if it could somehow keep me grounded. My name was called again, this time by the dean, and the diploma was handed to me with a smile I could barely register. I glanced out into the crowd, trying to spot my father and siblings, hoping for some kind of reassurance, something to anchor me in this chaotic moment. But all I could see was my mother, her presence looming large, her appearance an undeniable force that had shifted the energy of the entire room. My mind raced with thoughts. Do I ignore this? Do I pretend nothing is wrong and just walk off the stage, accepting this moment as it is? Or do I address the one thing everyone is already thinking about? The room felt suffocating, the pressure building inside me with every second that passed. And then, without thinking, I did something I never expected. I reached for the microphone. Time seemed to slow down. My hand, trembling slightly, moved toward the mic as the whispers in the crowd died down, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. I could feel the eyes of every person in that hall trained on me, waiting, anticipating. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I had no idea what I was going to say. I only knew that I couldn't let this moment pass without addressing the elephant in the room. With the microphone in my hand, I looked out into the sea of faces, my voice caught in my throat. My mother, my disheveled, dirty mother, stood at the back, watching me. I could feel her eyes on me, and in that moment, I realized that this was more than just my graduation. This was a turning point, not just for me, but for us both. I opened my mouth, my voice shaky at first, but then stronger as I spoke the words that would leave everyone in the room stunned. Chapter 4: The Shocking Revelation. I stood there, gripping the microphone, my heart racing so fast I thought it might leap out of my chest. The room had fallen into an eerie silence, every whisper, every movement had stopped. It was as if time had frozen, and all that remained was me, standing at the center of a whirlwind of emotions. My mind was swirling with thoughts, but one feeling pushed through above all: I had to speak. Not just for myself, but for her, my mother. My throat felt tight as I looked again at my mother, standing in the back, her posture slightly hunched as if she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. I could feel the judgment in the room, could sense the eyes on her, on us. They didn't understand, and maybe neither did I, but I knew I couldn't let this moment pass without saying something that would shatter the silence in a way no one expected. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the tremble in my voice, and spoke into the microphone. That woman standing there, I began, my voice barely above a whisper at first, but it grew stronger with every word. That's my mother. There was a collective pause in the room. Some people shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with what was happening. My voice cracked slightly, the emotion raw in my throat, but I kept going. I had to. She might not look like everyone else here today, I said, my eyes never leaving her. But what none of you know, what you can't possibly know, is what she went through just to be here today. I could hear the murmurs in the crowd starting again, people exchanging confused glances. But I ignored them. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about her and me. My mother has sacrificed everything for me, I continued, my voice steady now, filled with a determination I hadn't realized I possessed. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep food on the table. She gave up her own dreams, her own life, so that I could have mine. I saw people start to shift in their seats again, some lowering their eyes as the weight of my words began to sink in. And today, I said, my voice breaking just a little, she showed up, no matter what it took, even if it meant walking here because she couldn't afford a ride. Even if it meant she didn't have time to change out of her work clothes. She showed up. For me. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I let it fall. My mom, I said, my voice full of emotion now, is the strongest person I know. And if you're sitting there judging her for how she looks today, then you don't understand the first thing about sacrifice or love. The room was silent, completely still, as my words hung in the air. I looked at my mom one more time, her eyes filled with tears but also with something I hadn't expected, pride. She stood a little taller now, and I could see the love she had for me shining through the exhaustion on her face. In that moment, it didn't matter what anyone else thought. It was just the two of us, standing together in a way we never had before. I took one final breath, holding back the overwhelming flood of emotions. Today isn't just my day, I said, my voice soft but resolute. It's hers too. And I couldn't be prouder to be her son. For a long moment, the room remained silent, as if everyone was trying to process what they had just heard. Then, slowly, the applause began. It was hesitant at first, but it grew louder, stronger, until the entire hall was filled with the sound of clapping hands. Some people were on their feet, and I could see a few wiping tears from their eyes. I stood there, the microphone still in my hand, as the weight of what I had just said washed over me. I had done it. I had spoken the truth that no one expected, and it had changed everything. But the most important thing, when I looked back at my mom, I saw that she was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time that day. This was more than just a graduation. It was a moment that redefined everything. Chapter 5: The Aftermath of the Revelation. As the applause echoed through the hall, I stood there in a daze, still gripping the microphone, my heart pounding in my chest. I had just bared my soul in front of hundreds of people, but instead of the shame I'd feared, there was something else: relief, a lightness I hadn't expected. I turned to look at my mother once more, standing at the back of the room. Her face was no longer flushed with embarrassment. Instead, she looked peaceful. The tears in her eyes were not from humiliation, but from something deeper: an understanding, a connection we hadn't shared in years. She had heard every word, and it had reached her. I could see it in her eyes. As I stepped off the stage, my legs felt unsteady, the adrenaline still pumping through me. My father and siblings rushed toward me, their faces a mix of pride and something else, something softer, more emotional. My father's usual stoic expression had melted into something I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. "You did great, son," he whispered as he pulled me into a hug. His voice wavered, and I could feel the tremor in his body. My younger siblings were looking at me with wide, awe-filled eyes, as if I had just done something heroic. But my mind was still focused on my mother. I slowly made my way through the crowd, people parting as I passed. Some reached out to pat me on the back, others nodded with newfound respect. But I barely noticed them. I was walking straight toward the person who mattered most, my mom. When I finally reached her, she was crying openly, but her face glowed with pride. Her hands were trembling slightly, and I could see the dirt still caked under her nails, the creases in her work clothes. But none of that mattered anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had walked into the room disheveled and out of place, she was the woman who had fought for me, who had given everything for me. She took a step forward and pulled me into her arms, holding me tightly, as if she was afraid to let go. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my ear, her voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. I cut her off, shaking my head as I held her even tighter. "You didn't," I said softly. "You didn't embarrass me. You're the reason I made it here. You're the reason I'm standing here today." We stood there like that for what felt like an eternity, just holding each other, letting the emotions of the day wash over us. The crowd, the stares, the whispers, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was that, in this moment, we were together, and we understood each other in a way we never had before. As we finally pulled apart, I saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten with emotion: hope. For the first time in years, she looked at me not just as her son, but as someone who truly saw her for everything she was. The sacrifices, the struggles, the pain, it was all out in the open now. There were no more unspoken words between us. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice soft but strong. "I've always been proud of you." A lump formed in my throat, and I could barely manage a response. "I'm proud of you too, Mom." In that moment, I realized something profound. This graduation wasn't just the end of my academic journey. It was the beginning of something far more important, a new chapter in our relationship, one built on understanding, love, and respect. As we walked out of the hall together, the whispers and stares faded into the background. The weight of judgment was gone, replaced by a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The day had started with embarrassment and confusion, but it ended with something far more meaningful, a bond that was stronger than it had ever been before. The crowd might have been stunned by what I said on that stage, but the real shock was the change that had taken place within me and within us. This day would be remembered not just for the diploma I received, but for the moment I found my voice, and in doing so, found my mother again. We had both come through the storm, and now, nothing could tear us apart. Chapter 6: The Ripple Effect. The walk from the graduation hall to the parking lot felt surreal, almost like stepping into a new reality. My mom walked beside me, her hand clutching mine, and for the first time in years, the silence between us wasn't heavy or strained. It was peaceful, filled with a new kind of understanding. But I could still feel the eyes on us, whispers trailing behind like ghosts that refused to fade. As we stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, I saw some of my classmates and their families huddled together in small groups, stealing glances at us. They were still talking about what had happened, about what I had said on stage. Normally, the thought of being the center of attention like this would have made me uncomfortable, maybe even ashamed. But today, I didn't feel that way. Today, something had shifted inside me. I saw one of my friends, Nia, walking toward us, her eyes filled with something I hadn't expected: admiration. "That was brave," she said, stopping in front of us. "What you said up there. I think a lot of people needed to hear that." I wasn't sure how to respond. Her words were kind, but I could sense the weight behind them, the unspoken stories that lay hidden in her eyes. Maybe she, like so many others, had her own struggles, her own family burdens, that no one else saw. For the first time, I realized that my story wasn't just mine, it resonated with others in ways I couldn't have anticipated. "Thanks," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I didn't plan any of it. It just felt like it needed to be said." Nia nodded, her expression softening. "It did." As she walked away, I turned to my mom, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of pride and surprise. "You see," I said with a small smile, "you're not the only one people are talking about now." She chuckled, the sound light and filled with warmth. It was a laugh I hadn't heard from her in years, and it made my heart swell. But the ripple effect of my words didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I received messages from people I hadn't spoken to in months, even years. Classmates, teachers, and even some relatives reached out, telling me how much my speech had moved them. Some shared their own stories of struggle and sacrifice, of parents who had gone unnoticed or unappreciated. Others simply thanked me for saying what they never had the courage to say themselves. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from a teacher, Mrs. Kofi, who had always been supportive of me throughout high school but had never really opened up about her personal life. Her words were brief but powerful. "I saw your mother," she wrote. "And in her, I saw my own. Thank you for reminding me of what truly matters." Reading that, I felt a sense of validation I hadn't been searching for but deeply appreciated. My mother's sacrifice, her strength, it wasn't just our story. It was the story of so many others, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. In speaking out, I hadn't just given my mother the recognition she deserved, I had given a voice to countless others who had been overlooked. But while the outside world was buzzing with reactions to my speech, something more personal was happening at home. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in my mother. She was quieter, more introspective, but there was a lightness to her steps that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just my mom, burdened by the weight of endless work and struggle. She was a woman who had lived a hard life but now stood tall, knowing she was seen and appreciated. One evening, a few days after the graduation, I found her sitting on the porch, staring out into the fading sunset. I sat down next to her, the silence between us comfortable, filled with the unspoken bond we had rediscovered. "You know," she said softly, without turning to look at me, "I've always wanted more for you. I never wanted you to see the struggles I went through. I never wanted to be a burden." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You were never a burden, Mom. You were the reason I kept going. You're the reason I'm here." She finally turned to me, her eyes glistening in the soft light. "I thought showing up like that would ruin your day," she admitted. "I didn't want to embarrass you." "You didn't," I said, my voice firm but filled with emotion. "You made it what it was. You being there, as you are, is what made it real." She smiled, a small, grateful smile, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her as more than just my mom. She was a woman with her own journey, her own hardships, and her own quiet victories. And in that moment, I realized something that had been building since that day on the stage. This wasn't just my story, or even just hers. It was ours, woven together by years of sacrifice, love, and unspoken understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the porch, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. The weight of the past, the struggles, the embarrassment, the misunderstandings, it all seemed to melt away in the warmth of that fading light. For the first time in a long time, I knew that everything was going to be okay. This was only the beginning of our journey, one built not on appearances, but on the truth that had finally come to light. Chapter 7: Facing the Unexpected. The peace that had settled over us after the graduation was short-lived. Life, as it always does, had more in store for us than we could have anticipated. Just when it felt like my mom and I had found a new sense of balance, an unexpected challenge appeared, one that neither of us saw coming. It started small, like most things do. My mom had been complaining about feeling unusually tired, more so than her normal exhaustion from work. At first, I brushed it off, attributing it to the long hours she put in at both jobs. She'd always worked herself to the bone, and we were used to her coming home late, worn out but determined. But over time, the tiredness grew into something more troubling. She started losing weight, even though her eating habits hadn't changed. There were days when she'd come home and collapse into bed, too weak to even get up for dinner. I began to notice her grimacing when she thought no one was looking, rubbing her side as if something was bothering her. I tried asking her about it, but she would wave me off with a tired smile, insisting it was just stress. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The woman who had always powered through every hardship with sheer will and determination was now struggling in a way I had never seen before. It scared me, though I tried not to let it show. One afternoon, a few weeks after the graduation, I came home early from work and found her sitting on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets, her face pale and drawn. She was clutching her stomach, her breathing shallow. I dropped everything and rushed to her side, panic surging through me. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked, kneeling beside her, my voice shaking with fear. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and exhaustion. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I think something's really wrong." Without hesitation, I called for an ambulance. The minutes that passed before it arrived felt like an eternity. I sat with her on the floor, holding her hand, trying to keep my voice steady as I reassured her that everything was going to be fine. But inside, I was terrified. The strong, unshakable woman who had always been my rock was now the one who needed me, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was to come. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and anxious thoughts racing through my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about all the things I hadn't said to her yet, all the moments we had taken for granted. We had just found our way back to each other, after all those years of misunderstandings and unspoken sacrifices. The thought of losing her now was unbearable. When we arrived at the hospital, everything happened so fast. Doctors and nurses rushed her into an examination room, leaving me standing in the hallway, helpless and overwhelmed. I paced back and forth, my mind filled with worst-case scenarios. Was it something serious? Had she been hiding her pain for too long, afraid to burden me with her struggles? Hours passed before a doctor finally came to speak with me. His face was serious, but calm, and as he explained what was happening, I felt the ground shift beneath me. My mother had a serious health condition, something she had likely been ignoring for months, if not longer. They weren't sure of the exact cause yet, but it was clear that she needed immediate treatment and possibly surgery. It wasn't just exhaustion or stress, it was something much more dangerous, something that had been quietly taking a toll on her body while she pushed herself beyond her limits, day after day. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always known that my mother was strong, but in that moment, I realized just how much she had been hiding from me. She had been carrying this burden in silence, refusing to let me or anyone see her vulnerability. Even after everything we had been through, after the moment we shared on stage at my graduation, she had still tried to protect me from the reality of her own struggles. As I sat in the hospital room beside her, watching her sleep, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: anger, fear, guilt, and love, all mixed together in a confusing whirlwind. How could she have kept this from me? How could she have continued to work herself to the bone, knowing that something was wrong? But I also understood. She had spent her whole life putting others first: me, my siblings, even the strangers she served at work. She didn't know any other way to live. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath mine. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, we just looked at each other in silence. There were no words that could capture the fear we both felt, the uncertainty of what was to come. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want you to worry." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them back, trying to stay strong for her. "You don't have to apologize, Mom," I said softly. "But you don't have to carry everything alone anymore. I'm here. We're in this together." She smiled weakly, squeezing my hand. "I know," she whispered. "I just didn't want to hold you back." I shook my head, my heart aching. "You're not holding me back. You've never held me back. You're the reason I've come this far." The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, consultations, and treatments. My mother's condition was serious, but treatable, and the doctors were optimistic. But it was going to be a long, hard road to recovery, and for the first time in my life, I found myself in the position of caretaker, the roles reversed. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, terrified that I wouldn't be able to give her the strength and support she needed. But every time I felt doubt creeping in, I remembered the woman who had walked into my graduation, tired, dirty, and beaten down by life, but who still stood tall with pride. That same strength lived inside of me now. Together, we faced the uncertainty of what was to come. And no matter how hard the road ahead, I knew that we would make it through, because if there was one thing my mother had taught me, it was how to fight, even when the odds seemed impossible. This wasn't just another battle. This was the fight for the future we had both worked so hard to build. Chapter 8: The Fight for Recovery. The days following my mother's diagnosis were some of the hardest I had ever faced. The woman who had always been my source of strength, who had carried me through the toughest times, now needed me more than ever. But instead of crumbling under the weight of it all, I found myself stepping up, driven by a force I hadn't known was in me. My mother needed me, and I was determined not to let her down. Her treatment started almost immediately. Chemotherapy, the doctors said, was the best option given her condition. The news hit me like a wave, but my mom, she took it in stride, the same way she always had, with quiet strength and a resolve that I had always admired but never fully understood until now. The first session was the hardest. Sitting in that sterile room, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines, watching the IV drip slowly into her arm, I felt helpless. There was nothing I could do to ease her pain or take away the nausea and exhaustion that followed each treatment. All I could do was sit beside her, hold her hand, and be there. And somehow, that seemed to be enough for her. Between treatments, life fell into a new rhythm. I took time off work to care for her, juggling doctor appointments, medication schedules, and the constant worry that lingered in the back of my mind. But even on her worst days, my mother never lost her spirit. She would sit up in bed, her hair thinning from the treatments, and smile at me with a look that said, "We're going to get through this. Some days were better than others. There were times when she seemed almost like her old self, joking with me, reminiscing about the past, and making plans for the future. On those days, it was easy to forget the seriousness of her condition. But then there were the bad days, the days when the treatments took their toll, leaving her weak, frail, and bedridden. On those days, the weight of it all felt suffocating. I'll never forget one particularly rough night, when the pain was so intense that she couldn't sleep. I sat beside her bed, my hands gripping the edge of the mattress as I watched her struggle. She didn't cry out or complain, that wasn't her way. But I could see the pain in her eyes, and it broke me in ways I hadn't expected. "I'm sorry," she whispered through clenched teeth, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "I didn't want this for you." I shook my head, choking back the tears. "You don't have to apologize, Mom. I'm right where I need to be." But inside, the fear was overwhelming. What if I lost her? What if this fight was too much for her to bear? The thought of losing her terrified me, more than anything I had ever faced. She was my foundation, my guide, my reason for pushing forward all these years. As the weeks passed, though, something incredible began to happen. My mother, despite the sickness, despite the pain, started to get stronger. The treatments were working. Slowly but surely, she began to regain her strength, little by little. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope. One day, a few months into her treatment, we found ourselves sitting outside on the porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze. It had been so long since she had been able to do something as simple as sit outside and breathe in the fresh air. Her face was still pale, her hair thinner than before, but she was smiling, a real, genuine smile. "Do you remember that day?" she asked suddenly, turning to me with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Your graduation? When I showed up looking like I'd just crawled out of the dirt?" I couldn't help but laugh, shaking my head. "How could I forget? You were the talk of the entire ceremony." She chuckled softly, a sound that warmed my heart. "I was so afraid I'd ruined your big day. But what you said up there, I'll never forget it." I looked at her, the memories of that day flooding back. "Neither will I," said quietly. "That day changed everything." She smiled again, but this time it was softer, more introspective. "You know, I didn't realize how much I needed to hear those words," she admitted. "I've spent so much of my life thinking I wasn't enough, that I wasn't doing enough for you, for your siblings. But that day, you made me see things differently." I swallowed hard, emotions welling up inside me. "You've always been enough, Mom. More than enough." She reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're my greatest accomplishment," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I want you to remember that." In that moment, sitting there on the porch with her, I realized something. My mother had spent her entire life giving to others, working, sacrificing, fighting through her own pain to ensure we had the life she wanted for us. And now, it was my turn. My turn to give back, to show her the same strength and love she had shown me all these years. As the weeks turned into months, my mother's health continued to improve. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but the worst seemed to be behind us. And through it all, we had grown closer than ever. The fight for her recovery had become a fight for something deeper, a renewed bond, a shared understanding of what it truly meant to be a family. There were still challenges ahead, but we faced them together, side by side. And with every step forward, I knew that no matter what came next, we would find a way through it. Because if there was one thing my mother had taught me, it was that true strength doesn't come from avoiding hardship, it comes from facing it head-on, with love, determination, and the unbreakable belief that, together, we can overcome anything. The fight wasn't over, but we were stronger now and ready for whatever came next. Chapter 9: A New Beginning. As the months passed, my mother's health continued to stabilize. The treatments had worked, and though there were still follow-ups and occasional flare-ups, the worst seemed to be behind us. The shadows of fear and uncertainty that had loomed over our lives were beginning to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. We had survived the storm, but the journey had changed us both in profound ways. Life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. My mother was no longer the woman who worked herself into exhaustion without complaint. The illness had forced her to slow down, to take time for herself in ways she had never allowed before. I could see the difference in her, a quiet strength that came not from pushing herself to the limit, but from knowing when to rest, when to let go, and when to lean on those who loved her. For me, it was a lesson in responsibility and love. I had learned how to care for her in a way I hadn't known I could. It was no longer about trying to make her proud by achieving things, graduating, getting a job, proving myself in the world. It was about being present, about standing by her side in both the darkest and brightest moments. One afternoon, not long after her final treatment, we sat together in the living room, looking through old photo albums. My mom had always been the keeper of memories, tucking away photographs of our childhood, family gatherings, and even the tough moments, as if capturing them would make us appreciate the good times even more. We flipped through pages of birthdays, school events, and holidays, the images bringing back memories that made us both smile and, at times, tear up. "You were always so full of energy," my mom said, pointing at a photo of me as a kid, grinning widely while riding a bike. "Even when things were hard, you found a way to keep moving forward." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I wonder where I got that from." She smiled, but this time it was different. There was a softness to her expression, a recognition of the strength she had passed down to me, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. As we turned the pages, we came across the photos from my graduation day. The images brought back a flood of emotions, but instead of the embarrassment and anxiety I had felt then, there was something else, a sense of pride, both for what we had overcome and for the bond we had rebuilt that day. The last photo in the album was of the two of us standing together after the ceremony. My mother's clothes were still disheveled, her hair unkempt, but in the picture, she was smiling, really smiling. And I was standing beside her, my arm around her shoulders, proud and unashamed. "I'm glad you came that day," I said softly, my voice filled with emotion. "It wouldn't have been the same without you." She looked at the photo for a long moment, then turned to me, her eyes glistening with tears. "I almost didn't," she admitted. I thought I wasn't worthy to be there, not like the other parents." I took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You were exactly where you were meant to be. And I wouldn't have had it any other way." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything we had been through together filling the room. It was a silence not of sorrow, but of gratitude, gratitude for the second chance we had been given, for the strength we had found in each other. In the months that followed, my mother began to rebuild her life in new ways. She started volunteering at a local community center, helping other women who had faced similar struggles. It was her way of giving back, of using her experience to lift others up, just as she had done for me. And I couldn't have been prouder of her. I, too, found myself changed by the experience. I no longer saw life as a series of milestones to be checked off or achievements to be earned. It had become something deeper, a journey of connection, of love, and of learning what it truly meant to be there for the people who matter most. One evening, after another long day of work and school, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. My mother came out and joined me, as she often did now, the quiet moments of togetherness becoming a cherished routine. "Do you ever think about what's next?" I asked, turning to look at her. She smiled, the lines around her eyes softening with a wisdom that only comes from having weathered life's hardest storms. "I used to worry about that all the time," she admitted. "But now I'm just grateful for what's here, for what we have right now. Tomorrow will come, and we'll face it when it does." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle over me like a warm blanket. She was right. We had spent so much of our lives looking forward, pushing ourselves to the next goal, the next challenge. But in that moment, I realized that what truly mattered was right in front of us. We sat there together, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the twilight, our hearts full of the knowledge that whatever came next, we would face it together. This wasn't just a recovery from illness, it was a recovery of something much greater. We had found each other again, and in doing so, we had found ourselves. Chapter 10: The Journey Ahead. As time moved forward, our lives settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. My mother and I had found a balance, a quiet peace that came from everything we had endured together. The days were no longer defined by struggle or hardship, but by a sense of gratitude for the life we had rebuilt. But even in the calm, I knew there were still challenges ahead. Life doesn't stop throwing obstacles in your path just because you've survived one storm. There would always be uncertainties, health scares, financial pressures, and the unpredictable nature of the world around us. But now, we faced those challenges differently. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living, together, with a strength that had been forged through everything we had overcome. One day, as I was getting ready to leave for work, my mother called me into the living room. She was sitting at the table, a stack of papers in front of her, a look of determination on her face. "I've been thinking," she said, as I sat down across from her. "Oh," I teased lightly, trying to mask my curiosity. She smiled, but her expression quickly grew serious. "I want to start something new. Something that's mine." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" She pushed the papers toward me. "I want to open a small business. Nothing big, just something that lets me help people. Maybe a cafe or a small shop where women like me can come, share their stories, find support. A place that's about more than just making money." I was stunned for a moment, processing the idea. I had never seen my mother like this before. She had always been focused on surviving, on getting through the day-to-day grind of life. But now, she was talking about something else, about building a future, about creating something that would outlast the hardships we had faced. "That's an amazing idea," I said, the excitement growing in my chest. "I think you could really make a difference." She smiled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know. It's a big risk. What if it doesn't work out?" I reached across the table and took her hand. "You've faced bigger risks than this, Mom. And look where you are now. If anyone can make this happen, it's you." The uncertainty faded from her expression, replaced by the quiet determination I had always admired. She nodded, squeezing my hand. "I guess we'll see." And so, we began planning. The idea of a small cafe or shop quickly took shape, and before long, we were knee-deep in business plans, budgeting, and brainstorming ideas for what this new venture could be. It was challenging, but it was also exhilarating. My mother had spent so many years putting others first, but now, she was doing something for herself and I was right there beside her, supporting her the way she had always supported me. As the months passed, the pieces began to fall into place. My mother found a small space in our neighborhood, perfect for her vision of a community-focused cafe. She called it *Second Chances, *, a nod to everything we had been through and the new beginnings we had both found. It became a place where people could come to share their stories, to connect, to heal. It wasn't just about coffee or tea, it was about the sense of belonging that came with it. The cafe opened its doors on a bright Saturday morning, and from the moment the first customer walked in, I knew it would be a success. People came not just for the drinks or the food, but for the warmth and kindness that radiated from my mother. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, of creating an atmosphere that was more like a home than a business. As I watched her behind the counter, laughing with customers, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. She had taken everything life had thrown at her, the struggles, the pain, the hardships, and turned it into something beautiful. She had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had inspired me to find mine. One evening, after a long but successful day at the cafe, we sat together in the empty shop, the lights dimmed, the quiet hum of the city outside. My mother looked around, her eyes filled with contentment. "I can't believe we did this," she said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "You did this, Mom. I just helped a little." She shook her head, her expression serious. "No. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Not just the cafe. Everything. You've been my strength when I didn't have any left." Her words hit me hard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "You've always had the strength," I said quietly. "You just didn't see it. But I did. I always have." She reached over and took my hand, her grip firm but gentle. "I'm proud of you," she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you are. I looked at her, my heart full, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had truly arrived at a place of peace. We had both grown so much together, and as individuals, and now, we were building something new, something that would carry us forward into the future. As we sat there in the quiet of the cafe, I realized that this was what life was about. Not just the big moments, the achievements, or the struggles, but the journey we took together, the way we found strength in each other, the way we created a life filled with purpose, love, and resilience. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain but bright, and whatever it held, we would face it together. What would you do if you found yourself in a moment where everything changed? How would you handle the weight of family, responsibility, and unexpected challenges? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about resilience, family, and finding strength in the most unexpected places. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's keep this conversation going, there's so much more to explore together.